Okay, welcome everyone, both live and in Zoom. So I am here to, host the the MatSE recognition of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and we will do so by recognizing a number of important scientists and inventors that hail from these regions. I'm here in place of Dr. Gomez, who was unable to attend in person today, and I'll be introducing our series of 5 speakers who have identified 5 contributors that we'd like to highlight their contributions today. So we'll start with Professor Gopalan, who will introduce our first scientist and inventor.
I think Narendra Kapani, who is considered the father of fiber optics. Now, you might not have heard of him. I work in fiber optics, and I didn't know about it. Which is, he passed away in 2020, December of 2020. And he is considered the father of fiber optics. Now, there is another father of fiber optics, many fathers, Charles Kao. He won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And both of them are, worked in the similar time frames, and I wanted to maybe do 2 of them, but I decided I'll take one today and, talk about Charles Kao next year, hopefully. So let me talk about Narendra Kapani. Narendra Kapani, we take for granted the optical fibers, telecom, the Zoom session we are currently holding, but this is not very common. For example, I never worked on the internet when I did my PhD. It was a very unusual thing. For many of us, it's true, right? And Narendra, at least, what New York Times is doing, interesting entrepreneur, an imposing figure. He did more than anyone to make optics such a priority in government in the corporate budget. And slide, let me see, do I do that? Okay, so getting cut off here. He was born in 1926, I think, in Punjab, in British India. Probably now it's in Pakistan. And he went to the Imperial College in London to work with Professor Harold Hopkins. Harold Hopkins was a theorist. So he was one of the best known at the time in optics and photonics. And he had all these ideas. Now, it turns out that Narendra, he was studying in India, in Dehradun, and as a student in high school, his teacher told him light travels in a straight line. And he probably asked him some questions, and the teacher dismissed him. So he just sort of like, I'm going to prove this guy wrong. It just kind of became an obsession for him. That I'm going to prove him that the light can be bent around. And so he got a chance to work with Harold Hopkins. He took it. And Harold was theorized and began to go in the lab and start doing stuff. And their first work in 1954 came out in Nature was the first time optical fiber bundle was used to transmit an image from one side to another. And this was the first demonstration that this is possible. Okay? And then this is from Nature Photonics, after he passed away. He's considered by many as an unsung hero of father of fiber optics, because diverse in pioneering in the area, arguably not receiving the level of recognition that he deserves. So, I mean, a guy like me who works in the area doesn't know that, right? He's really sort of not recognized. He's one of the first thinkers to demonstrate bundle of fiber, find glass fiber that could transmit high resolution images. He performed very early experiments in the physics of coupling and propagation. In biomedical optics, he designed fiber optic hypodermic probes for imaging living human tissue. Now we do this all the time. He conducted early experiments to cure retinal detachment with lasers. Well, I had one some years ago, which is unusual. My retina got detached, and they screwed it back with a laser. Right? He was the first guy to try that. Also demonstrated optical oximetry with light, like the oxygen content. He designed key components for fiber optic-based communication systems. He made some contributions to solar energy. So a lot of things that it was done a while ago. Next slide, maybe I can do this. He coined the word term fiber optics. He wrote a Scientific American article. The word fiber optics was coined by him. He wrote the first book on fiber optics. He was a professor at University of Rochester. He came, after England, he came over to the United States. University of Rochester Institute for Optics is very famous. Probably the topmost in the country for many years. He was a professor there. He developed a perfect American accent with just the right touch of English and a little bit of Indian. So he cut a really imposing figure because a guy like him with turban, he's from Sikh religion, and talking like JFK was, you'd never forget him. So that's what his son says. He used his turban like a weapon. You see him, he talks like JFK. You'd never forget a guy like that. Okay, so he is finished in 55. The next 10 years, 30% of all publications in the field are from him and his group. Then he gets restless. He moves from Rochester to Illinois Institute of Technology. Then he moves again. In 1960, he goes to Palo Alto. So, he stayed like 5 years at Rochester in Illinois. Goes to Palo Alto, starts a company, Optics Technology. This is his first fiber optics company. In 1967, he starts another company, Natron. 1999, another one, K2 Optronics. He teaches, meanwhile, at UC Santa Cruz. He's a fellow of Optical Society of America, American Association for Advancement of Science, British Royal Academy of Engineering. And he was a noted philanthropist. He had a number of chair professors at Santa Cruz that he endowed, chair in optoelectronics, entrepreneurship. He started a center there for innovation and entrepreneurial development. And he also, was wanted to, you have to remember this was all 1950s and 60s. So there's some historical background. He was a very unusual guy, a guy with a turban. Asians themselves were very rare. So 1965, a bit of history, Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. That was when the restriction on Asian immigrants was lifted. That's why I'm here. That's why most of the Asians you see today, are here because of that lifting. It started in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act by Chester Arthur, right? And it went on to 1965. So this guy was doing all this stuff when he was, Asians were very rare. And plus, he also looks distinctive. And so he was a larger than life kind of a person. So he wanted to establish, make sure people knew who Sikh, where and why, what his background was. He had a large collection of Sikh art and literature. He donated it to San Francisco Asian Art Museum, funded a gallery for its display. His daughter, said he was really devoted to telling people not just about his scientific passion, but also about his culture. So, so that's Narendra Kapani for this. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Venkat.
Cool. Thank you. Have the honor of recognizing Dr. Peter Tsai, Professor Emeritus at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And he was the professor who had invented the charged microfibers that are used in N95 mask filters. So pretty relevant deal, at least in this modern time. And just a bit of his history, he had graduated in National Taipei University Technology and Chemical Fiber Engineering at Taiwan, where he then worked in industry in that country for a few years before deciding to pursue further education and understanding the why behind technology he was working with. So he moved to the US and received his master's in material science at Kansas State, and then continued for his PhD at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where he then built his 34-year academic career in non-woven fabrics, and in particular, electrostatic fiber filtration technology. And he left retirement in 2020, despite retiring in 2019, to go back and research how to decontaminate masks during the pandemic. So zooming into a particular invention I wanted to highlight. Oh, okay. Yeah, so back in 1994, so about, from what I read, about a decade of research, he had invented a way to impart a quasi-permanent charge to polypropylene microfibers during the melt blowing process via corona charging, which ironically named, but that process involves the ionization of air via high voltage, and that air being what's surrounding a certain point in the melt blowing process. And that allows these fibers to have both positive and negative charges, which allows them to then sequester charged particulates in the air that would otherwise, due to their submicron size, easily just go through the pores in these filters. And he continued to improve on this technology throughout his career, with one of his last works in 2019 being a patent to introduce how to further boost the filtration capacity by introducing suction-based hydrostatic charging method. And this, funnily enough, the first decade or so of this invention, it was mainly just used in application of home air filters. It wasn't until some time until the CDC realized, oh wait, you could use this to filter viruses as well. And then that got implemented into surgical masks and are still in them to this day. And this invention alone already is one of significant impact and would have already been a strong capstone and foundation for his career. But I believe that it's what he had done ironically after his career that really makes him stand out. Which is a year into his retirement, COVID-19 pandemic happened, and he was suddenly assailed with emails all over the country and world asking about these masks, since he had invented the material behind them, and how whether these masks can be reused or how can you sterilize them without losing the charges that in the filter. So he went and answered these questions and left retirement. He turned his house and van into a little makeshift laboratory and ran experiments on these masks to figure out what sterilization conditions would allow you to reuse these masks at without losing efficacy. And from then he communicated not only through publication, but also with nurses on Zoom calls on how they can conserve masks. So he participated in direct outreach there, all at the same time lending his expertise to Oak Ridge National Laboratory on how to convert existing facilities into those that can fabricate these charged filters at scale to help combat the mask shortage. And all while doing so, it was noted anecdotally that he had refused to be paid for his work. He just wanted to help people the way he could, which is by him being the person who invented this material. And this incredible sort of ingenuity and, more importantly, the work ethic and duty, I believe, likely may have just picked up throughout his life, but I think a good starting point for all of it might have been his background growing up in Taiwan. So his daughters had written an article about him, TaiwaneseAmerican.org, and describing how as a kid he had grown up on a family farm in Taiwan, one of 10 children, and he had, with his first sign of ingenuity, he made his own roller skates from door rollers to have fun with. And as myself and other children of Asian immigrants would tell you, our parents would always tell us how they had to walk several miles to go to school every day. And sure enough, he had told his daughters the same thing, and it was something he had to do as well as a kid. And in his early years in the US while pursuing a master's, along with working at a fish and chips restaurant during the summers to help fund himself, he somehow did that while taking over 500 credit hours of classes across multiple STEM disciplines. Really don't know how that's possible, but it just is a testament to his both fascination with the field and his work ethic. And he had told his daughters that it's not only about the quality of the work you do, but how you make a difference for the people you work with and the final result of your accomplishments. And in this recent years, might not necessarily be his final result, but certainly really momentous one that really defined his career looking back, is inventing this material, these charged filters that have in turn saved countless lives decades down the line. And I don't know if that was something he had imagined when he had first invented it, but oftentimes people find out how to apply this research, and it's always fascinating to see that.
All right. Well, Louis, thank you very much for the discussion. Okay, our next presenter will be Agatha.
All right. Hello, everyone. Today I will be speaking about Polynesia and example, and I got that close. Next slide, please. So Polynesia is decorated with a lot of awards, and I would say that one of the most notable things about her is she can really take another man's treasure and turn it into, or another man's trash and turn it into treasure. For her case specifically, another company's or byproduct waste and turn it into treasure. She has received many awards and has also published at least 90 papers. Next slide, please. So the thing that motivated her when she was younger, there was a river near her hometown, and she noticed that everyone were floating to the top. And quick again. All right, yeah, so she noticed that there were fish floating at the top of the river, and as a young child, she thought, oh, this is great, and this is easy to go fishing, very plentiful, quick again. But then when she got older, she realized it was actually the waste. A lot of people in her hometown were getting sick and just wasn't a very conducive environment to healthy living in. So next slide, please. She was born in Surabaya, Indonesia, and then went to I'm not sure. She went to university and was a student with a focus on chemical engineering sustainability. So again, taking that basis of trying to take something old and make it into something new. And after she attended university, she went to Australia and after mastered in philosophy and chemical engineering, where she then okay, yeah. So then, after getting her master's in philosophy in Australia, she went to Nationality University, and she got her PhD in chemical engineering. So very consistent with chemical engineering and also focusing on sustainability, where she still took things that were traditionally thrown in the garbage and made them into something that you can use. She's interested in wastewater from her childhood, and the cassava puree. She cassava is like a yuca or a starchy kind of like a potato, and orange juice. How it pasteurized once the ozone layer started to deplete. And next slide, please. After she went back to her original university, and she is still currently there, says there's a bar on the bottom that she is the director of an all-English double major chemical engineering program as well as deputy dean. And she's been here from 1999 until now, so she does like going back to her roots and taking things that are wasteful and turning them into something that we can use as a student and lecturer and researcher. So here are a few of the more recent things that she's done. Again, taking passion fruit peels, which is typically a waste, and more treatment. And she is a very distinguished woman in the field of STEM, especially in Indonesia and Guam. And she did a lot of work there. And we should do it again. And I think that's right.
So once this gets going, by the way, I'm Pat Mather, chemical engineering, and recently set up a lab in 318 for polymer nanofibers. And what I'm going to be talking about today, who I'm going to be talking about is Professor Xu Yang, who is the Joseph Bordogna Professor of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also, I think for the past 2 years, the chair of their material science and engineering department. And what I show on this slide, hopefully everybody can see this on Zoom, I think so, is a depiction of one of her most recent accomplishments, that which is a material for camouflage. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Her lab, I'll tell you a little bit more about her history in a moment, but it's very interdisciplinary. She, I guess in one sense, she would call herself a chemist, but she's also a material scientist, and she's very interested in the intersection of polymer science and inorganic materials and functional materials. So her lab is described here, interested in multi-materials, nano and micro fab, device processing. It's a remarkably rich set of problems that she works on. I'm very envious of the funding that she gets as well at home. And so she answered, her group develops questions and attempts to answer questions about surface and interface interactions, actuation mechanisms, which the camouflage benefits from, and structural properties within the material science paradigm. I came to know her through, I can't remember how long I've known her, but something like 20 or 30 years. She and I work professionally together through the journal Polymer Reviews. So I work with her on sort of that professional setting of peer review. And she's just a pleasure to work with. She's a powerhouse too. I love her style, and probably one of the most creative material scientists I've ever met. So if you go to the next slide. She started her education at Fudan University in China, and she got a material science degree there. Fudan is a remarkable university. Every person I've ever encountered that came out of sort of the materials or engineering world from Fudan has done remarkably well in academia. She, after graduating from Fudan, she came to the US and did her graduate work at Cornell University, switching a little bit more into chemistry, although she works for Chris Ober, who some of you may know, that sort of spans a lot of different areas, chemistry, material science, you name it, and got interested in multidisciplinary approaches to material science. And then she got a master's and PhD there, and then I think she did a postdoc and landed at Penn nearly 20 years ago. So if you go to the next, or if you click through, I'll show you sort of the branch of the family, academic family tree that she's part of. So she did her PhD with Chris Ober, who's still there at Cornell. Chris Ober did his PhD with Bob Lenz, who pretty famous polymer scientist at Amherst. And then go up the tree, connected to Syracuse and McGill University. All right, let's go to the next slide. So professionally, Xu, as I mentioned, is serving an administrative role as the chair of material science and engineering at Penn. She has graduate students from multiple disciplines, showing the strength and depth of her and confidence across many different fields, and her areas are shown here below and pictorially with interest in biomaterials, colloids, liquid crystals, and composites. I think lately, the area getting the most attention from her lab is in liquid crystals, in particular, polymeric liquid crystals that serve as actuating materials that have color change as well. So her group tries to answer hard problems about soft materials, and most of her funding these days is in how that interfaces with sustainability. So let's go to the next slide. She's been spending a lot of time focusing on LCE stands for liquid crystalline elastomer, which is like, those are like almost oxymorons. Liquid, what is it? So at the intersection, the reason it's liquid crystal is you might be familiar with small molecule liquid crystals in our displays and so forth. If you then cross-link them in a way that still preserves softness, you now have a liquid crystal elastomer. And what she's done is made them into, focus on the folded part, the actuation mechanism, instigating programming and reprogramming strategies of the shape of the material, and explores potential applications. So into this platform, she adds a lot. Her group, like liquid metal, you can put eutectic liquid metals in there for electrical properties, for example, make electrodes, graphene, carbon nanotubes, etc. And she has been publishing in how to field, if you put such a material in a field or apply electrical current to them, they change their shape. So let's go to the next slide. I showed this on Google Scholar just to show sort of a snapshot of the trajectory of her career. I guess she got her PhD in '99, and there's sort of no bound to this trend. She's highly active, H-index 75, and just keep cranking along. I will mention as another personal anecdote, she hosted one of my undergraduate students in her lab 2 summers ago, and she came back like on fire. Now she went back to Penn to pursue her PhD with somebody else, but I owe a debt of gratitude to her for sort of the inspiration that she instilled in M Sharp. She's doing biomaterials research at Penn. Okay, the next slide. So this, I just thought I'd highlight one thing about the work she's been doing in liquid crystal elastomers towards camouflage materials, because I think it's such a cool design that she came up with. This appeared in Nature Materials very recently. And what the idea that she had that was so interesting is to combine like microfluidic devices with a material that changes its color by stretching. So, and why does it change its color? I had to read his paper to see what she's doing. She took a regular liquid crystal elastomer and added to it. So inside, I have to say a little bit about this. Inside that material are mesogenes, or little rods, and then the rods line up almost like stack of pencils or something. Just there's an entropic reason for these things to all align. To that, she added what's called a chiral domain, and to give it some handedness. And internally, there's layering of materials related to this chirality. That's the color. And so if you stretch this, you actually change the spacing of the layers in the nano regime. So you can go from blue to red or red to blue and any color in between. So that's what she did in this paper, and then combined it with microfluidics. So if you ever see like a Braille device or any sort of static Braille that's got little dimples on it, she makes dynamic dimples for camouflage, where if you pressurize, it lifts up the material and changes its color depending on the pressure. So the last slide is here. There's one more slide after this. This is just an idea from her paper for the mechanical properties. This is strain versus inflation pressure on a little piece of the device. So as you add more pressure beneath it, the thing stretches. Not only does it stretch and come off the paper, so maybe she could make dynamic Braille, but it also changes the color. And if you do that in a closed loop based on the background, you can sense the background color inflate just the right amount so the thing disappears as a sort of camouflage based on the surrounding structure. So the final slide is a little bit this sort of from her abstract. We geometrically program the size and layout of those air channels. That's the network, the microfluidic network behind the material to achieve color shifting from near infrared to ultraviolet wavelengths. And so if you could click on this, it takes up, hopefully this would work. There's some videos from the supplementary material on this cool paper. See if it pops up. And we might have to did another thing pop up, please? It worked. Anyways, I can send it out to all of you. The videos are fun to watch because the color changes so subtly with small changes. And then what's cool, you can just go back one slide. I'll say a little bit more and then I'll be done. Just go back. What she did so creatively is if you, for the same pressure, if these are different, like the R is different or the dimension is different, depending on the size of it, it changes its color a different amount. So if you have a diversity of different sizes, for the same pressure, you can get a different color change. So then the skin is like a whole bunch of different diameters. One pressure gets applied and suddenly you have a whole variety of colors. So, so that's what I wanted to say about Shu Yang. I think we should probably have her come here and give a talk sometime. She has a really impressive a faculty member at Penn in the middle of doing a lot of cool things with soft materials. So that's all I know.
And I think our final presenter will be Dr. Gomez.
Thank you for the introduction, JP. And it's my pleasure to highlight Natasha Balsara. Natasha Balsara is a well-known prominent polymer scientist, a pioneer in a variety of different areas. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a minute. Natasha got his bachelor's of technology from in chemical engineering from IIT Kanpur. He got a master's at Clarkson and then a PhD at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic University. He did 2 postdocs, one with Matt Terrell and Tim Lodge at the University of Minnesota, and another one at ExxonMobil with David Losey and Will Gressley. He then started his career in 1992 at Polytechnic University in New York. That doesn't exist anymore. It's been absorbed by NYU actually, but back then it was called Brooklyn Polytechnic. But then he moved to UC Berkeley in 2000s, where he's founded 2 companies actually, CO, which was bought out by Bosch, and Blue Current. He's received many awards for his work in polymer science and soft matter, including the Diddle Medal from the American Physical Society. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society, as well as the Stein Award from the American Institute for Chemical Engineers. So I mentioned that Natasha has been a pioneer in a variety of areas. So let me give you a couple highlights in that. For example, he's really done a lot of seminal work in the thermodynamics of polymers, as well as in nucleation. So many years ago, he figured out that, well, even though we don't know that much about what happens in the initial stages of nucleation, polymers are very slow, right? And as a consequence, you could do experiments that are very difficult to do otherwise to be able to study initial stages of nucleation. And so he did that for some time, and it was really, he really pushed the limits of theories of how nucleation occurs and what happens basically as it begins, because you could take advantage of the slow dynamics of polymers to be able to really see some of the key aspects of nucleation in these systems. But of course, one question that he always had was whether this was, inherent to polymers. To him, there's nothing intrinsic about it being polymers, about what he was studying. And so he actually, in one of my favorite papers of his work here, he partnered with David Chandler to be able to show, using some Monte Carlo simulations as well as experiments, neutron scattering, to demonstrate that in reality, some of this work on initial nucleation was rather general and should occur basically for any phase separating system. And so in that way, he's pushed basically soft matter science and really kind of material science beyond just polymers by demonstrating how initial stages of nucleation proceed. He's also done a lot of work on the thermodynamics of polymers, for example, and how do you mix polymers together? How do you design surfactants? For example, this might be important, for example, for things like recycling. But how do you design architectures where things are chemical structures where they might be more favorable, less favorable. He's demonstrated how the small details of where you put branch points, for example, can lead to significant changes in the interaction between different polymers. I'm going to highlight one piece of work from that, and it's kind of like a summary of the body of work in a sense. This is it's a relatively famous for folks that work in thermodynamics of polymers. This chapter 19 of the Physical Properties of Polymers Handbook. One of the things that Natasha's done for the community is actually collect the interaction parameters between polymers. This is basically how we can predict whether things are going to mix or not. And he's collected them for as many systems as you could find at the time that he's published. He's on the second edition of this now. Now with Hani Aitoni, a former graduate student from his group. But he's collected basically these interaction parameters. He's actually parameterized them because for a long time, there's this question about what should the reference volume of interaction energy should be, right? If you don't have let's say a reference volume that everyone agrees upon, then the interaction energy can be rather meaningless because, you know, you always have to pay attention to what reference volume people are selecting. He was the ones that basically pioneer a common reference volume. It's summarized in this book here and the tables that accompany it, that now the community for the most part uses it as a whole. Okay. Another area in which he's been a pioneer is in block copolymer electrolytes. Now, he wasn't the first to develop this concept of making a block copolymer solid electrolyte, but he was the one that really demonstrated that this unique architecture or this unique material system can actually decouple ionic conductivity from mechanical properties. So for a long time, the story of solid polymer electrode was that, well, the softer the polymer, the higher the conductivity, because ion motion in polymers relies on segmental motion. And so if you make the polymer, if you force the polymer to slow down to make it stiffer, then also ion motion slows down. So you kind of get into this this trade-off, which seems unbeatable, and as a consequence means that they're not very useful for actual material systems. Well, it turns out what he showed was that you could actually microphase separate, right? You could create nanostructured materials where one phase is responsible for conducting ions and the other one is hard and responsible, for example, for providing mechanical rigidity or even stopping the formation of lithium dendrites. And this has led to a bit of a revolution in the field in terms of how we design solid electrolytes and how we make these, I guess, multi-phase solid electrolytes, you know, that are nanostructured, that have been demonstrated to be able to stop lithium ions. And actually his companies such as Blue Current and SEA were based on this concept and have been rather successful and demonstrated in practical ways that these types of materials can make an impact. Okay, so this is his original paper on the concept back in 2007. This is a follow-up showing he's basically done a lot of work since then in understanding some of the physics of how ions move through polymers, how ions move through nanostructured polymers. How is it that these materials are able to stop dendrites, and how are they able to basically conduct ions while at the same time not allowing dendrites to percolate through, and so on. Now, I've known Natash for some time. He's my mentor when I was a graduate student. And so I've had the pleasure of, going over to his house, as he likes to invite folks over to basically, share a meal, have some fun. And one of his favorite things to do is to sing. He loves music. He plays the guitar rather well and then sings rather well. Actually, his wife is an opera singer. And so often the nights, evenings at his house at dinner end with a nice group sing-along where everybody sings and so on, or plays all kinds of assorted instruments. One of his favorite things to sing is actually songs written by, and I can't remember if it's his cousin or his uncle, but anyway, by one of his relatives. His name is Farrokh Bulsara, or that's how he was born. He changed his name to Freddie Mercury some time back, the lead singer of Queen. So one of favorite Natasha's things to do is to sing Queen songs, taking the place of Freddie and then singing along, and he actually does it rather well. So I don't have any recordings to share with you. That would probably be a little too much, but nevertheless, he's a lover of music. So if you ever meet him in person, I encourage you to talk to him about music. And that's all I have for today.
All right, thanks, Enrique, and all of our contributors today. That's all we have. So I guess we'll see you in our next department's diversity enhancing event. Bye, everyone.